So I want to start out with a piece of poetry, which I know on a Friday morning might be risky. And I want to ask you guys to sort of find yourself in a seat. And if you feel comfortable, close your eyes, soften your ears to this following poem. It's entitled, "The World I Live In." I have refused to live locked in the orderly house full of reasons and proofs. The world I live in and believe in is much wider than that. And anyway, what's wrong with maybe? You wouldn't believe what once or twice I have seen. I'll just tell you this. Only if there are angels in your head will you ever possibly see one. So good morning and welcome to Creative Mornings. I think this is an awesome topic. When I was asked to give this presentation, I had a mix of feelings, one of which was utter excitement because I feel like I've been a student of curiosity in my entire life, and I'll show you some of the things that has manifested. But I was also daunted because it's such a deep and rich topic for what we do as creative professionals. So if you think about the poem that I just talked about by Mary Oliver, Mary Oliver is a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet. She's very prolific. She's still alive, so if you guys want to go out and read her work, I would strongly recommend it. But there's a line in that poem that talks about this orderly house full of reasons and proofs. And when you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we all need that. We all need to have this sense of safety and security and belonging. But I have a strong suspicion that the folks here in this room, the brilliant creatives that have showed up here today, understand the value that exists beyond that world of safety. And it's my belief that most of us live at least part of the time, and maybe most of the time, and maybe in our vocation, and maybe outside of our vocation, in this world of possibilities. So I actually think curiosity is one of those topics that in today's sort of culture is at risk. There's a lot of things coming in to sort of invade on what we can do and deploy and how we think about curiosity. Those things include the bombardment of social media, the many screens that we look at, and the worlds that we work within, which are very, very fast-paced. And if we all remember ourselves as a child, there was no question that, and I love that there's a couple of children here, there's no question that curiosity was absolutely part and parcel to their lives. But a funny thing begins to happen. So kids go through terrible twos, and then once they have a fairly strong grasp of language, they begin to ask the million questions that parents know and that wear us down, but they're also beautiful questions, and they range from why do elephants have trunks, and why is the sky blue, and Mom, why do I have to eat this food, and all kinds of stuff. But what happens is that, and it's a little bit unfortunate, once we go from preschool into elementary school, and then into middle school, high school, college, and beyond, we're actually more tested, and the idea of questions begins to dissipate, and we're measured more on what we know than what we don't know. So there's a truism that exists is that there will always be the case that what we know is going to be far less than what we do know. So what I'm going to talk about today is a wide range of things that has to do with curiosity. I'll talk about it a little bit from my life perspective and the things that I've done to deploy curiosity. I'm also going to give an example of someone who I think we will all agree is a shining example of curiosity. And then I'm going to get into some tools that will actually help us, all of us, cultivate more curiosity in our lives. So my world sort of exists, at least vocationally, in sort of three areas, and I'll talk about these very, very briefly. So many of you here in town know that I'm president and founder of an organization called The Nth Degree. I've been in business. I founded this company back in 1994. And today it exists as essentially a brand consultancy, which means we go into corporate environments and we work with our clients. And what we do is we mine the most deeply held beliefs of those organizations, bring language around those things, put that language and the beliefs within the culture, and then ultimately express them out into the world. And we do that in very powerful ways. We do that across the globe for companies big and small, and even some of the local companies. In fact, as I look out over the water here, and I'm reminded of the rebrand that we did just last year for the Port of San Diego. And so, hope I get this right. There we go. And so the next world that I live in is a new startup that I founded with two partners. And the startup is called The Studio. And The Studio works with organizations through the lenses and practices of artistry, and we work with leaders to help them instigate, deploy, and think more like an artist. Now, we're not training people on how to be an artist, but we're actually encouraging them to take chances, to deploy more innovation, more creativity, better communication. And we work with those leaders in workshop settings and retreats, and we also do some guidance system for them. So that's The Studio, studioleadership.com. You can find out about that more. And then the third part of my world kind of came out of the closet, if you will, last year as a fine artist. Now, I'm trained as a fine artist. In fact, my undergraduate degree is in fine art, and I was privileged to study with a protege of Mark Rothko in New York. And I got a great training in the school, the traditional school of the New York School of Painters. And I've been painting for 30 years. But only last year did I decide to actually begin to show that work. And so it's a big step for me. It's a little bit courageous. And I want to show you a little clip from a film that Helium Films put together for me. And this film goes out to collectors, and it also goes out to galleries who are looking to represent my work. So I promise it's relatively short, but I also promise that it ties into today's conversation. To undergraduate school to study fine art up in Boston. And interestingly enough, at that school, I got a very classical training, but I also got a minors in philosophy and psychology. So what drives people, what we think about, the important questions of life, this whole developmental aspect of understanding ourselves has always thrilled me and always fascinated me. So most of my work as a painter is the exploration of the dualistic side of our humanity. We're going through life as these physical beings having a physical experience with other people, but at the same time we're really having a spiritual experience. So there's this beautiful unseen self. An artist for me, it doesn't necessarily mean you're a painter or a poet or a musician, but an artist for me is going through life with a deep sense of self-discovery and curiosity about your place in the world. I think, great art should always be shaking people from their everyday awareness, shaking people from their everyday life, and inviting them into a world of curiosity, and then helping them see their life, the world in a very, very different way. I think it all begins and ends with the individual. And so the more that one is aware of who I am, what my place is in the world, the more you can show up as an artist and constantly create for the betterment of humanity. So again, I want to give a huge shout out to Thierry, who's here with Helium Films. He was kind enough to work with me on this project. This is a very small clip of a much larger video that sets up on my website, stephenmorris.gallery. So really proud of that work. It's been incredibly well received, and honestly, in putting it out into the world, it was a little bit frightening to do so, because a lot of people see me as this brand strategist, which I'm happy to be seen in that way. But true for all of us, we have well-rounded or fully realized human beings. And so sometimes in our vocational world, we only allow part of that to show up in our lives. And so part of my invitation today is to encourage all of you to show up fully as the brilliant human beings that you actually are. So I'm going to talk about what I think curiosity is. And to me, it's essentially, and especially for the folks in this room, it's the operating system in which we do our work. You know, we live in this world of possibilities. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of data and sort of the dangers of data later on. But we live in the world of possibilities, and a lot of the folks in this room are required, asked, and expected, and even paid for, handsomely, hopefully all of you guys, to bring that which doesn't exist into fruition. And so curiosity, I believe, is both the doorway to creation. It's also the doorway to learn anything new and to get into the realm of what I consider the unseen and the mysterious. So my working definition for curiosity is that, and I apologize for the slides, there's actually a very subtle image that sits behind this, which I have a question about, but I can't even ask. So curiosity is a state of dynamic neutral. So what do I mean by dynamic neutral? It's one of those really interesting paradoxical phrases or word sets that seem to counterbalance one another or seem to offset one another. The dynamic part is that curiosity actually requires us to lean into something, to go out and have a relationship with something. But one of the things about curiosity is it's quite delicate. It's actually quite shy. So curiosity needs to develop a communication, a conversation, and even a dance. And so those things that you're curious with, you're going out and you're thinking about those things, and you're developing a relationship with those things, and you're even developing intimacy with those things. The neutrality is really interesting, because in order to be curious, you actually have to suspend all the knowing, the experience, and your preconceived notions about situations. So if you go into a situation and you feel like you already know it, then you're probably not curious. You're just going into it with the assumption that I already know this thing and it has nothing to teach me in return. When you get into the dynamic portion of it, you actually do this, there's this little bit of like, you pull back a little bit in the neutrality, but then there's also this leaning forward in the dynamic nature. So it's a very delicate thing. So I want to talk to you about, actually in the previous slide, there was this great photo of this, of a sculpture by a, I don't remember the guy's name, but he's a Middle Eastern artist, and it's this big bronze that sits in the Boboli Gardens in Italy. And so hopefully you guys all recognize this gentleman. His name was Leonardo Da Vinci. Well, actually still is. Nobody took it away from him. Walter Isaacson created a great book. If you guys haven't read the book on Leonardo by Walter Isaacson, I would strongly recommend it. He is one of the most prolific, historically, it's been like everyone has talked about, he is the guy who's been the most curious. So Leonardo's life, and a lot of you guys already know this, ranged from not just his artwork, but he went into sculpture, into city planning, into building machinery, sometimes for war, sometimes aqueduct type systems that were much more efficient. He studied architecture, and one of the things that he did when he opened up his first studio in Milan, which he ultimately got kicked out of, he opened it up a block away from a medical school so he could have access to fresh cadavers. You just think back in the day of the Renaissance and like kind of what the courage it took to actually, and the smell and all that kind of stuff. But he was a student of the body. And so he was a student of the body because he wanted to understand not just how the body worked, but how to better render, better draw, better paint, and better sculpt the body. One of the things that blew me away about this particular book, and it's been well publicized since, is Leonardo's to-do list. So this is just one example of the to-do list. So you just imagine, right? Okay, so we're all going to leave here, and we're all going to go out, and we're going to draw the city of San Diego. This is just one element on his to-do list, and I have little notes here, but I'm going to just talk about a couple of the things that also sort of blew my mind on his to-do list. So it's calculate the measurement of Milan and the suburbs. Let that sink in for a second. Examine the crossbow by the crossbow master, Maestro Giannetto. Let's see, get the master of arithmetic to show you how to square a triangle. And I almost had a slide up here, but I didn't want to have a slide with a bunch of text. But the interesting thing about his to-do list was the verbs that he put in front of the wide-ranging things that he was curious about. So the verbs range from not just draw, but calculate, find, discover, get the master, ask the master, examine the crossbow, find the master, ask. These are all things that are infused within the world of curiosity. So I would encourage you all to read this book. If you're all curious about curiosity, he is a shining example that I'm sure likely none of us will ever live up to, but we can certainly learn from. So I have some truisms that I put together about curiosity. One of which is that we cannot consume and create at the same time. Now, you guys know probably what this means, right? So I see a lot of you on laptops and smartphones and things like that. Hopefully, this talk is interesting enough that you're not checking your social media feeds or things like that. It's okay to tweet and talk about some of the things here. But when you're in the social media world, when you're looking at the news, when you're even reading a book, you're in consumption mode. And you cannot be both in consumption mode and creation mode. And because this room is full of creative professionals, you actually have to live much more so in this creative mode. Now, you should have information that informs that creativity or informs how you go about that work. But know that when you're trying to do both at the same time, you're probably failing at both. We cannot know and be curious at the same time. It's what I was talking about before, about suspending the things that we already know. The further we get along in our careers, the further we advance the corporate ladder, the further we're expected to know. And in a lot of corporate environments, big or small, it's actually not okay not to know. And I think, or part of my invitation here today, is that you should give yourself permission to sometimes not know. And I'm not talking about being incompetent in your particular role or job or function. I'm talking about when you're asked a question that might be a new thing, it is okay to respond with, first, I don't know, and then secondarily, a very intelligent question or set of questions that leads to more intelligent answers. And I'll get into questions in a little bit. So the third thing that I have here, and I want to be very careful about how I talk about this. I imagine that there are some individuals in this particular room who are actually responsible for collecting and analyzing data. I don't want you to think that I'm anti-data. I think data is incredibly important. Data measures the past. It can measure what we're doing. It can be very insightful for what the data can point to. But the reality is, data never really created anything. It can create some insight that leads to better questions, that leads to better creations. But we're living, ladies and gentlemen, in this realm right now of big data. And I actually think there's some danger in that. And I've begun to talk about it from the mindset that big data is kind of a false god. There is a lot for it to teach us, but it will never create innovation. It can inform better questions, it can inform insight, it can even inform behavior from audiences and the way they click through things, even things like heat maps or whatever we want to measure. It can definitely measure those things, but it will never drift into that realm of creation. Hopefully I didn't spook you guys. All right, so now I'm going to get into, I want to keep a track on time here. I want to get into some tools to cultivate more curiosity in your life. And as I thought about this topic, I actually thought about more tools than I really even had time to deploy at this point. So one of the things I did, and you'll see it in the very last slide, is I put together a little PDF file of some additional tools that you guys can help. And it's free to download. Just go to the landing page that I built, and you can deploy more tools. So the first tool is we ask lots of questions. So this is fairly obvious, right? So of course we ask lots of questions, but it's the quality and the type of questions that we ask that are the things that lead to better informed answers. So there's all kinds of questions. So how, what, when, where, why, and not yes or no questions. Those are all great. I also believe that dumb questions are really good questions, because dumb questions equate to questions that are humble, or if they're asked in the right way, they're done from a sense of humility and a sense of suspension of the things that you already know. So I have a couple questions question types that I want to drill into. So blue sky questions. These are the open-ended style of questions that typically begin with things like what if, or what could it be, or you guys have probably heard some of the mindset around the 5 whys. So you ask a question, why this? And then you drill in further. Why is that important? Drill in further. Why is that important? Until you finally get to some really interesting information about the thing that you're inquiring about. So this is one of my favorite things to think about. And I had the honor to study for a year with the poet, philosopher David Whyte. I'm not sure, show of hands who've heard of David Whyte. Okay, not a big David Whyte room, it's totally fine. So and if you really want to find out about David, he did a TED Talk. He closed out the last TED stage at the most recent TED Talk. I think they do that in November. Anyhow, gave a great talk. I've had the privilege to spend a lot of time with David, traveled the world with him, studied with him, and he has this thing, so this is not my thing, I'm giving him total credit here, called beautiful questions. And beautiful questions can be asked in lots of different scenarios, but I think beautiful questions are best asked when they're directed in those realms when we're really trying to explore our place in the world and our trajectory in life. And so some of the definitions behind what makes up a beautiful question is, 1, it cannot be answered by the strategic mind. And that means it taps into another part of ourselves that isn't about just problem solving. The other part of a beautiful question is that it's more like a live with question. And so if you guys have read the book by Michael Ray called The Highest Goal, he taught a great course up at Stanford called Creativity in Business. And he has this process called live withs. And so they're questions that you go for a week long, and actually more they're like statements that you live with for a week. So an example of one of his statements would be, do only what brings you the most pleasure. Now, if you can imagine living with that for a week and trying to show up to work and doing some of the things that you don't really love, so that his mindset would be, okay, how do you put love into those things, or how do you deploy them with more pleasure so that you can get pleasure from them and change your relationship with them? Beautiful questions are kind of the same thing in that you actually really do have to percolate with them for a while. You have to let them sort of ingest within you. You have to embody those questions. And then, let's see. So I have a couple of examples and so I'm going to share some things here that are directly out of my journal of some beautiful questions that I've written for myself. So this is a question directly from my journal. What is it that I'm dedicated to? And you can answer that in lots of different ways. That can mean, what is it that I'm dedicated to in my personal life, in my relationships with my children, in my vocational work, in my artwork, things like that. And again, these are not strategic questions. These are embodied questions that should be answered from the highest self that we possibly can. This scared the hell out of me when I wrote it. I looked at this question, and the answer in my heart was no. So imagine writing that question. Do I actually want to become the person I'm practicing to be? And if that answer is no, then it yields into a whole lot of other questions, which is, well, who is the person that I want to be? And then how do I practice to be that person? What is my relationship to mystery and the unknown? I think this is an ongoing question that we should probably all be asking ourselves. And I don't necessarily mean or think that it's a spiritual question. It's a question that can drive us through life and help us understand who we are. How is my inner critic suppressing my curiosity? So, Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert, she talks beautifully about the power of the inner critic and the role of the inner critic. And she, I think in that particular book, she talks about it through the lens of fear. And she's got this great thing where she talks about, she knows fear is always going to be there. Fear is something I'm not going to get rid of. But what she does is she gives fear an assignment. She says, look, you're going to be here. You sit in the chair, where you sit in the back seat, we're going to go along for the ride. You don't get to touch the steering wheel. You don't get to touch the radio. You don't even get to touch the map. You can't even tell us where we're going to stop for snacks. So these are the kinds of things, like, because the inner critic can be our biggest enemy when it comes to the things that we're curious about. So these are just some examples of what I mean by beautiful questions. So tool number 2 is we listen without judgment. So I have this thing that I call the 90-10 rule, and I deploy it primarily in business settings when we're talking with a new client or we're really doing a strategic session. And the 90-10 rule is very simple. It means that I am talking 10% of the time, and the client or the clients are talking 90% of the time. The reason that that is important is because my only job in that room, or my set of jobs in that room, is to first suspend all of what I understand about that organization, get to the questions and the real problems that that organization is facing, and me asking hopefully very smart questions that lead them to unveil where their real issues are, where their problems are, and how and if we or the organization help solve them. Because you've all been in those situations where a client calls up, they say, I need a new website, my website sucks, we really need to fix this. Well, the reality is, that's probably not the issue. Or it might be part of the issue, but this 90-10 rule helps to get to the solution of what the real issues are to determine not just whether or not it's a website need, but how to fix that website need. We embrace silence and non-distraction. So, have you ever wondered why we come up with our best ideas in the shower, or when we're out running, or walking through the woods and things like that? It's probably crossed all of our minds, and it probably drives some of us a little bit crazy, like, I'm in the shower and I can't even capture this idea, unless some people take their phone in there, which I think some people do. So what happens with that is that you're coming up with those brilliant ideas and those insights because you're tapping into a different part of your consciousness. So here's the way I explain this. So your conscious world exists in sort of like, if you can envision this sort of 2-foot bubble that exists around you, right? And it's sort of your current awareness. It's all the things that you're sort of currently thinking about. It's the problems that you're sort of running through your head with. It's the book that you just read, or the Wall Street Journal newspaper or article that you just read. It's those things that are just immediately feeding you. The subconscious world is beyond that. And we have to get out of our own way to get into that subconscious world. And so what exists in that subconscious world? It's made up of everything that exists, including the conscious world. And so what do I mean by that? So it means the collection of your entire past. Your subconscious world might tap into a conversation that I had with a colleague years ago. Or it might be a book that I read in junior high school that just comes into my fruition because I've gotten all the clutter out of the way. Or it comes in the form of a question that we've thought about for a long time but hadn't really solved. And it also taps into the wisdom, all the intuitive side of our life, and even the higher self that exists within all of us. And the more that we can put ourselves in a state of unconscious world and make room for those things to come in, the more we can actually create brilliance in our lives. So that leads into this point, which is we make time and space for curiosity. So I've been experimenting with this thing called thinking time. And it's an early experiment, so I can't unveil, here's what the results are, or things like that. But it's once a week, I'm trying to schedule an hour to an hour and a half where all I do is think. And I know this may sound utterly ridiculous, and you may not give yourself permission to do so. And so that thinking time is you find a place, ideally with a wide horizon, probably in a natural environment, where you leave your phone behind, or you don't pull it out unless you use a tool like Evernote, like I do, to capture notes, or you simply take a journal, or you go for a walk in the woods. So maybe like a beach setting with a wide horizon, and all you do is sit there and think, and you let your mind wander into the wide variety of things that you're thinking about. And it is not a strategic set of thinking. It's not like, okay, well, I've got this problem with this client, and I really need to solve it, and I'm going to schedule an hour and a half, I'm going to go to the beach, and then I'm going to have it all figured out. It's not that. It's more like I'm just going to go out there, or wherever that is, and it could be in your own backyard, and just let your mind wander. Do you guys remember like growing up as a kid, and like you're in an old station wagon with your family? I'm talking about my stories here. You're in an old station wagon with a family, and you're doing a long road trip, and all you're doing is looking out the car, and your dad's playing some dumbass stuff on the radio, and it's like, you don't want to listen to that. It could be anything from, I don't know, just like top 40 stuff that they liked but we didn't, and or talk radio or whatever. I don't know. So, but your mind is wandering, and you're almost bored. You're like just about to head into boredom, and then your mind starts to wander and think, and all kinds of ideas come to you. And so that's what I mean by thinking time. So morning rituals. I could talk all day long about morning rituals. I think they're really important. I think they're really important to distill and employ within your life. So one of the things that I do, so my morning ritual looks like this, and you don't have to copy this. I'm just saying, here's what works for me. I'm a morning person. So even creative mornings for me, it's kind of redundant. Like every morning is creative for me, right? So I wake up and acknowledge that when you wake up, you're coming from a world of subconscious awareness, if you're aware. And then I go directly, after I use the restroom, I go directly into meditation. And I typically set a timer for 15 to 20 minutes, and I meditate. I have a journal that I only use for this ritual right by me. When that meditation is over, I go right into journaling. I have a process about that journaling, and then once that journaling is done, it takes 15, 20 minutes to go through that process. So I'm already just like a half hour in, 40 minutes in, and then I go and move. And typically my morning looks like either running or yoga or surf. And so this then calibrates and starts my entire day that builds on the subconscious awareness things that I'm interested in, and then I can take that momentum and move it forward. That's my morning ritual. You can actually look up online. There's a lot of different morning rituals that are out there that you can learn from. I would experiment with them and then be incredibly consistent with them. This is the no slide slide. It's really, really important. So the last point that I'm going to talk about here is that we live in the world of possibilities. And so I'm stealing this thing from the Irish poet, philosopher, John O'Donohue, who was unfortunately passed. And he has this thing called the 7 questions. So we all walk through this world with a series of 7 questions that are rolling around in our head. And they're the same things that we're sort of asking ourselves time and time again. So my prompt for you guys as you leave here and go out into the world is to write down, think about what are those 7 questions, and then ask yourself, what are the 7 questions that I haven't yet flirted with? And then write those down and begin to have a relationship with those things. So we as curious and creative individuals, we need to welcome surprise and mystery in our world. And I'm not going to talk about this too deeply because we're running out of time, but in Mary Oliver's poem, she talks about what's wrong with maybe. And I think that creative professionals live in this world of paradox. And what I'll talk about just really briefly in that is that, you know, on one side of things, there's this world of safety, which I've already talked about. We have to have safety in our world. And in that world of safety, we feel most comfortable. On the other side of the world, we have this world of adventure, of unknowing, of discovering new things. Now, too much of that, too much surprise in that realm can create anxiety. So what we're looking for is this beautiful little sweet spot that sits in between those two things. And sometimes we'll dance back and forth between those two things, but I believe we can actually live a near perpetual life of curiosity if we balance those two things. And so my last little slide here is just tools for you guys, the friends of curiosity. Stillness, or silence, stillness, presence, wide horizons, which I've already talked about. Nature, there's this whole thing the Japanese deploy called forest bathing. Guys, get out in nature, and even the Buddhists believe that you should get out in nature and have conversations out loud with yourself. One of the things that I do, and I know I sound crazy when I do it, I read and retain a lot of poetry. And so I will walk through the woods of Penasquitos Canyon, which is near my house, and I will talk poems out loud. And this is crazy town out loud, just like the poem I just shared with you. And the birds are like, what the? Yeah. So like I said, there was more tools that I really had to put into this talk. If you guys want to download this tool set, just go to themthdegree.com/curiosity. Little form there, super easy to download. And now it's time for Q&A.